Welcome to Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and it's my pleasure to welcome back longtime guest and my erudite occasional co-host, poet and writer Lee Slonimsky, to talk about and read from his latest collection, Pythagoras and the Animals. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Sharon. Great to be with
It's
you.
so great to have you back. And I'm going to read your bio, including Pythagoras and the Animals. Lee Slonimsky has published 11 books of poetry. In addition, his sonnet sequence, Pythagoras in Love, has been translated into French, Greek, Polish, and most recently into Italian. He manages a hedge fund that advocates for the rights of animals. Lee, let's jump in right away with a poem.
Great. Okay, so this poem, the title is Pythagoras' Bees, and it has a prescript from Sadi, who is a 13th century Persian poet. That's actually has a title of its own. One night I was thinking, the fascinating drowse of the morning keeps the traveler from traveling. And now the poem. The fascinating drowse of small white bees in dreamy hover over red petals distracts Pythagoras. He doesn't see a hawk's stiletto-sharp trajectory, hypotenuse of plummet scything air towards sudden talon spike of careless hair. Nor does he notice first light's trapezoid, branch etched in pond, scarlet geometry. He's sleeping with these bees, though wide awake. Savant of minutiae, he loves the balm. Mild wafts of air offer bees slow float and him. Sweet scented haze. There's nothing wrong with all the world in this tableau that soothes. Bees startle into flight, but he won't move.
There certainly is nothing wrong with this tableau or this poem. It's really beautiful, Lee.
Thank you.
Lee, for our listeners, you've been very, very associated with Pythagoras for a long time. Who is Pythagoras?
Pythagoras was a 6th century Greek philosopher and political advisor who is best known probably for a theorem that most historians would say he had nothing to do with.
Really?
Well, the earliest there is documentary evidence of the theory of Pythagoras' theorem 300 years before he was born in Egypt. And one theory about his connection to it is that it's known he made a trip to Egypt in his youth, and that he may have brought back the theorem, which had serious benefits in terms of home building, among other things. And presented it as, well, if not as his own, then certainly as something he discovered somehow. And so it became associated with him. In any event, his major contributions to civilization are really not in mathematics. He is a philosopher who founded a school of philosophy. He's acknowledged by Plato as the biggest influence on him. He's a thinker about the state of the universe, and he also strongly believed in really the equality of all life forms, which makes him, for example, in the words of the New Yorker magazine, the first vegetarian. And he's also someone who is known to have, advocated for what we would now call a vegan diet, and he was also interested in actually the emancipation of women and the end of slavery. He was an advisor for decades to the ruler of Magna Graecia, which at the time was really the most important place where Greece was spoken. It was the west and east coasts of modern Italy, and it was a kingdom. And he went there, and that's where he really spent most of his life and became known. And eventually he was exiled to northern Italy. Many historians believe because the population got very resentful about the ascetic lifestyle that he had advocated.
Thank you, Lee.
You're
And
welcome.
yet, you a lot of your poems, including this poem, um, there's a true relationship between nature and math. Could you describe that a little bit in this poem?
Well, I think the depth of this, the depth of the connection between nature and math it's very profound. And I don't know that I really get too insightful in the poems, but it's a basic fact of the universe that there's number attached to everything, um, as is represented in a famous kind of mythical way by the creation sequence in the Old Testament. And Pythagoras, had attached significance to certain numbers for various reasons. But if we look at modern science, obviously there's a number count for each element, and there are all kinds of numbers that we live with and are aware of every day that without addressing the sort of creation or religious aspect of this, show a very deep level of organization. And Pythagoras, I think the most important fact that he derives from this is really that the same creative and mathematical source is responsible for all life, and that all life is organized. A famous example of that from modern science would be that I believe a housefly has something like 83% of the genome of the human being, and so he took from that very powerful ethical conclusions.
That's very disturbing. Between us and the fly.
Well, I think
I'm
that
kidding.
yeah, okay, yeah, because I mean, essentially,
Shocking.
it's well, the of course in Darwin's day, they didn't have knowledge of DNA and sort of what amounts to scientific proof, but basically, he certainly observed and wrote about the similarity of kind of the plan, for example, two eyes, a mouth, a nose, etc.,
Mhm, mhm.
that goes through probably about the last 700 million years when modern life has has been evolving.
Mm. Lee, would you read for us Pythagoras Listens for Love?
Gladly.
Thank you.
Pythagoras listens for love. How blind the blonde caresses of the sun, which tenderly embraces him as well as orange leaves, their summer lush undone, and geese in eastward flight, whose pattern tells of mathematics ruling wind-whipped skies. But he can't feel the love that light gives leaves, nor be betrothed like leaves are to the earth. He needs Elena's warmth, her lips and sighs. Her absence overrules his feeble search for solace in a noisy sun-split breeze, whose calculus arranges nearby clouds and measures swaying angles of the trees. He listens for her love, hears not a sound. How cold the empty air, the wind-streaked ground.
That's lovely. Lee, who was Elena?
Well, Elena is a fictional character. I will say this about Pythagoras. For the length of time ago that he lived, which is essentially over 2,500 years, there's a fair amount of documentation of his life for various reasons. But certainly, so it's known that he had a wife and a daughter. It's not, their names are not known, but it's known that they existed, and that when he set up a ruling council in Magna Graecia, they both served on it, which is one of the bases for the belief that he was a very early advocate of the emancipation of women. However, that's the only fact that's known about his personal life. And so in putting together my own biographical ideas about, how to write about him, I came up with the idea of an early love named Elena, who eventually he loses, but then who comes back many decades later. And so the key point there is that he loses this relationship, in part, as the poems present it, because he's so involved with his own work. There's an element where she winds up marrying into the monarchy on Sicily, but this is all fictional.
Okay, that's great. You write most of, if not all of the poems in this book, as you do in many other books, in sonnet form, including there's a variation sonnet form in this poem. Could you briefly describe sonnet form and why you've chosen this type of poem for your expression?
I originally began writing about Pythagoras by a kind of mental accident where I misremembered the name of the Petrarchan sonnet, which is from the great Italian sonnet writer, Petrarch. I remembered it as the Pythagorean sonnet. So the
Huh.
narratives kind of got intertwined since approximately 2002 when
Mm.
this mistake happened while I was out walking.
A happy accident.
Fortuitous. I will say, I want to say something about the sonnet, but I will add that I was very startled 13 years later, I think, when I learned in my research that Petrarch actually was very influenced by Pythagoras, as was Dante, and that Petrarch made comments about Pythagoras being the true mentor of his poetry writing. So I've always been, kind of struck by that. But as far as basically what the sonnet is, I mean, it's a 14 line form that originated in Sicily, again, in Italy, in the 1200s or 1100s. And the first sonnet was written by an accountant at the court named Giacomo de Lentini, and that poem still exists in the Vatican Library. It's 14 lines. It has various rhyme schemes. The two most common types, the Italian has 5 rhymes, the Elizabethan, which Shakespeare wrote in, has 7. And there's also an English poetry tradition of iambic pentameter, which is 10 syllables or 10 beats in each line with the accent on the even numbered ones, 2 through 10. There is a diversification of the sonnet really going on in American and actually in Western poetry, probably maybe for about 100 to 150 years now. And so there are sonnets that are pretty far afield of this particular description, but I think the heart of the description is 14 lines
Mhm.
and back to the original Sicilian precedent.
Mm. Thank you, Lee.
Well,
Would you read Pursuit for us?
be very happy to.
Thank you.
Pursuit also has a prescript, and that comes from a fragment of Sappho, the famous poet also of antiquity, fragment number 118 from If Not Winter by Anne Carson. And it is, yes, radiant lyre, speak to me, become a voice. And now the poem. How small the weight of light, even at noon. The pond is barely creased by shimmer, gleam, as leaves thrust rays aside. So shadow rules these tangled woods, their stream splashed muck and murk, and waters glisten that listens to his thoughts, convincing him he's not alone. Just then he hears soft murmurings, a woman's voice in dialogue with ancient oaks. Her lilt surpasses warblers, subtle as a breeze that ripples shadows. Sappho wanders too, her voice a lyre summoning the sun, but spidered bramble hides her from his sight. He follows her, pursuing fleeting notes, faint butterflies that tumble, flutter, float.
I love this poem. I sing, and it has special resonance for me. And her voice summons the sun. So much beautiful imagery in here, Lee. And you also talk about light and shadow, and you do that a lot in your poems about Pythagoras. Could you just briefly comment on light and shadow in your poems and in this poem?
I'll be happy to. I just want to add that an oddity of this poem, the prescript from Anne Carson's book, If Not Winter, which is her Sappho translation, is that this poem also fictional, but partly arising from the question of whether Pythagoras and Sappho ever could have met, and their
Mhm.
estimate of their age overlaps in terms of she's earlier in the 6th century, like around 580 maybe. The idea for writing a poem in which they meet actually came from a conversation that I had with Ann Carson in Montreal. Also, maybe 2003, another sort of happy accident where we discussed this in terms of the chronology, and she suggested that I maybe try writing some poems that connected the two. So
Mhm.
that is why I feel like
Oh, I didn't know that. Anne Carson, for us who don't know, is a contemporary poet who's also a classic scholar. And she writes beautiful, very stark poetry that sort of harkens back to the ancient world. So that is fascinatingly.
on the light and shadow, I mean, I would say a few things about that. I mean, for the most part, I don't think there's any plan or logic behind their use. I think they kind of naturally come from sense of imagery in poems that are taking place outdoors and often in woods, which of course have a lot of light and shadow. Beyond that, another contemporary figure to Pythagoras is Zoroaster, and of course, Zoroaster is in some ways one of the earliest monotheistic, not exactly monotheistic, but
It's the Persian religion,
right.
Zoroastrianism.
It is into the current time a Persian religion. But I
Mhm.
just want to say that I have wondered about Pythagoras. I think he had elements in his thinking that did involve a struggle between good and evil, and so I don't know whether. Uh, well, I think the big difference in terms of there being somewhat contemporaneous is that there is, as with the ancient Greeks in general, they did not believe in a monotheistic,
Mhm.
let alone a benevolent God. So there would have been a big gulf between them. But I think for my own use of light and shadow, I kind of try to echo the Pythagorean idea that there is a basic tension in the world, even if it's not expressed in religious terms.
Oh, I like that. Thank you. Lee, would you read next for us? Exile with Wings.
I'll be glad to.
Thank you.
Exile with wings. Triangle wakes merge as ducks swim ashore. These gleaming ripples, clear phenomena of math and curves, like these with which birds soar, or heavenly trajectories of stars, or variations in the sun's swift rays, which arrowing can measure each new hour. Pythagoras has spent so many days observing these ducks swim and gray geese soar that mastery of winged creation's math has come to him as if his mind grew wings. So solitary this trans species path, which makes him long to tell his thoughts to birds. If only wind could translate a few words, his flesh would feather, dullest speech would sing.
Mm. His flesh with feather. Isn't that beautiful? That's Lee Slonimsky reading Exile with Wings. And this trans-species path. I mean, you've often written about Pythagoras' connection to other species. Would you elaborate on that, Lee, please?
Sure. That is an idea that I think has many antecedents probably in prehistory, but Pythagoras drew ethical conclusions from it that are, I think, fairly unique. He believed in something called transmigration of souls, and that is that all of our lives, whatever type of being we are fleeting, but that there's an immortal soul, similar to the Hindu idea of reincarnation, and that is a result of essentially that all life forms originate from the same source.
Mhm.
A modern idea of that might be that flesh is made of atoms and molecules, and that everybody is made of that, and that those things are immortal. That's an idea that's in Whitman's poetry, which I think he
Mm.
had pretty widely in various ancient philosophers. But essentially, because of this close connection, it therefore becomes wrong to kill or harm or eat connected species.
Mm.
And I just want to make an aside on something that I was not aware of until a few days ago, but to show the persistence of this conflict in all world cultures, we just had in New York State uh, the appointment of a new chief judge of the appeals court who has encountered controversy because of a lawsuit that was brought on behalf of a elephant at the Bronx Zoo called Happy. And in his dissenting ruling, there were two dissents, but his ruling was that there was no personhood for elephants, meaning they weren't identical to humans, but they did have rights based
Mm.
commonly being alive, which is a Pythagorean idea, as sure as I'm sitting here. I'm able in that way. The relationship between Pythagorean thought and Western religion, especially Christianity, is a big topic on its own. But I just want to say that many people who in antiquity who believed in sort of the common origin of species did not see that as giving rights of various kinds to these other species, and
Mm.
Pythagoras did. And this is where even today he would be kind of a controversial, on the fringes thinker.
Absolutely contemporary.
Yes,
Incredible. Why was Pythagoras exiled, if you would tell us briefly? Because it's called
right.
Exile with Wings.
Yes. Well, these are pretty well-known facts, actually. They're recorded in several contemporary accounts. He was a chief advisor to the king, and as I mentioned earlier, they prescribed a very ascetic vegan lifestyle for the population, and resentments developed from it. That's believed to be at least one of the reasons why the government was overthrown. The government, Pythagoras's home, they are known to have been burned to the ground, and there
Mm.
was some assassination attempt, but he fled successfully and was exiled in Metapontum, which is a northern east coast of Italy city that is still there, just like Crotona, which was the capital, is. And he fled. Uh, this would be maybe 300 miles to the north, and spent the rest of his life there in exile. Although there is no narrative fact about his life after he goes to Metapontum, and I have in this book taken some liberties with what might have happened to him in exile. But most people believe that he actually, as an adult, never lived in Greece. Although
Huh.
you can't understate the importance of Magna Graecia at the time. Eventually, it's replaced by the Roman Empire. I mean, it was a big deal, but there's no evidence that he ever returned to Greece.
Lee, would you read another exile poem called Arrested in Exile?
Yes, arrested in exile. It's onerous at times. His self-assigned prisoner's assignment. Count the trees on 90 wooded hectos, property of Metapontum royalty. He sees no way to find a formula for sprawl, a tangle, mayhem, wind-cleaved branchery, last night's storms, wild and murderous assault, do not allow for trigonometry or other measures. Now, late afternoon, he's spent, His only thought a cooling breeze and rippling stream. He naps, but must awaken soon. If spotted by a guard, he could return for underground entombment, endless dark where madness lurks, and awful silence burns a hole in any thought. He struggles awake. Discovery would be a fatal mistake.
Lee, would you think, I think this is one of the darkest poems in the book. Do you agree?
That's a great question. I mean, it's, it certainly has a really dark thought in it, which is the idea of underground. It's the equivalent. Actually, we somewhat have that in modern life, which is prisoners sent to solitary
Hmm.
confinement when
Hmm.
they're already in prison. And this is, I believe, for a personality like Pythagoras, as active a thinker in many other aspects of his life, that this would have been a terrible thing to worry about. So, in that sense, yes. There is no, I will say again, it's fictional because there is no record of any of the details of his exile in Metapontum.
Hmm.
The one fact that I do use in these poems in general is that Crotona was a hot year-round Mediterranean climate, and Metapontum had seasons.
Hmm.
The track of Pythagoras's life as we know it, it would have been his first encounter with autumn leaves, with snow, and so forth. So he's seeing this for the first time, maybe in his late 50s. So I find that fascinating, and I do make a lot of use of that.
You've done such deep research for this and your other work and study on Pythagoras. It's
Yeah, I'd like to mention, and thanks for the compliment, a particular book, which is very much available. I mean, it's on Amazon. It's only a couple hundred pages. It's a really great book. It's by University of Pennsylvania philosophy professor named Charles Kahn, and he just does a fabulous job of summer. This is 20 years ago it was published, but it's a fabulous job of incorporating all the research that has been done. And I had no idea before I read this book of the historical, well, maybe little snippets, like there's a bust of Pythagoras on the facade or the former facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Turns up in music, he turns up here and there, but I had no idea that his historical record, for example, in the Roman Senate before the was overthrown and became the Roman Empire, with about 600 members. At one point, the political party that was loyal to Pythagoras, and this is 500 years after he died, has 175 members. It's the largest party.
Mm.
If you go to Rome today and you go to the Forum, there is a bust of Pythagoras that the members of the party used to meet around. This is, I just
Unbelievable.
not to go into, wild detail, but this is a narrative that is essentially extinguished in many ways because in the early days of Christianity, the Pythagorean belief system, which was very prevalent among the middle class in Rome and in Greece, was seen as the biggest potential rival to Christianity.
Oh,
And so we have a history that is complicated, but we're here 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years later, and most people in the Western world do not know about this unless they make an effort.
you've written a book before called Pythagoras in Love, which has been translated by Elizabeth Coleman into French and into Italian, I believe.
Elizabeth J. Coleman, who is a great poet
Right.
in her own right, and I won't.
Wonderful poet. French.
She did the first translation in 2008, and really, although it took a while to publish it, that was sort of the breakthrough, which eventually led to the idea of publishing in a bilingual Greek edition. And then this past fall, a distinguished Italian playwright named Enrico Bernard, who is a pretty well-known figure in Italian theater from the 1970s on. He became interested in the book, and It was just published in Italy a few weeks ago, and unlike my Greek books, it is accessible to Americans on the internet. Amazon, I believe it's amazon.com.it. You can easily find the book. It's just out a few weeks ago.
And the genesis of Pythagoras and the animals. Would you talk about that?
Right. So I've had a lot of good fortune with, Pythagoras in Love in Greece. It was things that are very difficult that really, I mean, it's very unexpected, of which probably the two most unusual things that happened were that a song was made out of one of the poems in the book by UK rock group, which actually had run into the book in Greece, and that's on YouTube. And there was a film production that was started, being filmed in Crete. Unfortunately, they made half of a film about the book, and it's not finished, and they're looking to finance the rest of it. But that really flabbergasted me. In any event, it had good sales, and so when I went to read a year and a half ago at the Thessaloniki Book Festival, my publisher asked me to do a second collection, and I have a lot of poems, and that have been neglected in one way or the other. And I'm hoping, since I'm going to read there again in a couple of weeks, to possibly get started on a third. We'll see. But I also need to mention my translator in Greece, Stamatis Polonakis, is one of the most prominent poets in Greece. He won the 2017 National Poetry Prize, and his own audience and his own interest in the book really was crucial to getting it the kind of audience. The second translator for Pythagoras and the Animals, in addition to Stamatis, is a Greek poet named Katerina Myakoupi. I might be not doing great with the pronunciation of the last name, and she did incredible work on these poems.
Εδώ λοιπόν ξεκινάει η ιστορία του ερωτά του με το φως. Αυτό το ήσυχο απόγευμα, καθώς ο ποταμός κυλά, ξαπλώνει με την αγάπη του μέχρι να πέσει η νύχτα.
The way the river polishes the stones, so round and smooth to perfect little spheres, reminds Pythagoras of wind and bone, and how mortality draws ever near. So here begins his love affair with light, this sleepy afternoon, while river flows. He lies with until approach of night, and yet now reassuring is the sun, whose midnight flash of gold turns stones to jewels. He feels revived as if life's just begun. However frail the flesh, the mind still rules. So here begins his love affair with light, this sleepy afternoon, while river flows. He lies with until approach of night. Her kisses goes on to its rendezvous with shimmering sea, and ready him for death if death must be.
This is Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and I want to reintroduce my guest, Lee Slonimsky, who's here to discuss and read from his book, Pythagoras and the Animals. And you've just heard a song called River that relates to Pythagoras and to Lee. Lee, would you explain a little bit about the song?
So the river is a poem in Pythagoras in Love, the first book, near the end. And well, my best knowledge is that a Greek music producer read the book and presented it to a rock group in England. Then at that point, I was asked for, basically signing over the rights to the words. It is the exact words of the poem, but they're rearranged and one stanza is repeated. Anyway, it then in the summer of 2021, it got airplay in Athens, which is a very big city, big market. Played on the radio for a while, and I can only say that I was shocked by the whole thing. I mean,
It's in English too.
there is a Greek poet who reads for about 10 seconds at the very beginning of the song. But basically, yes, there is in Greece is, at least in the big cities, is a bilingual culture. Greek students ever since World War II and up until the present day have to study English up to age 18 through high school, and it has a very close historical relationship with England. So that's why it was able to be produced that way.
And the YouTube how would people listen to this again if they would like to?
On the YouTube, I think it's actually the title "The River" with the in front. I think
Okay,
if you type that in, I think it comes up.
great. Lee, would you read Cycles in Samos for us?
Yes, I'll be glad to. And I just want to say that Samos is the historical birthplace of Pythagoras. This is a certain historical fact. This is known. Anyway, in my imaginary exile, he manages to get a momentary respite, and he is able to return to his boyhood home. Cycles in Samos. The time between all waves is like a clock that measures quiet, poise. Irregular, it's true, for no two lulls are quite the same, but rhythmic. And somehow pause reassures Pythagoras of calm amidst wild spray, gulls wheeling, sunlight gleaming. He can take a theorem, he is sure, from ratios between wave crumbles and the intervals that follow sleekly, or divide a breeze by seagulls swerve to understand her flight, work hard. But now the cresting rhythm lulls him into ponder, merging with slow light. He's of this surf, he speculates, from wind. Soon after crests crash down, new waves begin.
That's Lee Slonimsky reading Cycles in Samos from his book, Pythagoras and the Animals. I love that, the time between all waves. And that's the time after it crests and before it falls, right, Lee? That interim time.
It certainly appears in Shakespeare, for example, in the one of the so-called two perfect sonnets, number 60, like as the waves make toward the pebbled shore, and then it goes on.
You're like Pythagoras in making all these connections. And I remember a connection you've made between trees and humans and their common ancestry millions of years ago.
Yeah, that actually.
That's reminding me of that.
That's a late 90s news story that actually discovered what they believe to be DNA. This is 1.1 billion years ago. right at the point in which this lineage split between life, like plants that couldn't move
Mhm.
and animals that could. And that actually, I was struck by that when I read it. I read about it, but I'd have.
It's a wonderful discovery. It makes sense somehow. I mean, there is a song called "I Talk to the Trees."
Well, I think for myself, it's a critical moment in the history of life. And just to mention another poet here who works in this vein is a poet named Sarah Lindsay, who writes, extensively about scientific history. And Sarah Lindsay's big moment, which I've also written poems about, is the moment when the first fish or amphibian walked on land, which is known to have happened around 330 million years ago, and which there are now different theories, for example, that first fish, which is the lungfish,
Mhm.
that it didn't stay. That I'm just mentioning this as
I
an
mean, it went
aside.
back into the water. It didn't like the
Went
land.
back for quite a while, like 20 years, but yeah.
Would you read Professor Emeritus? And emeritus is in parentheses because I want to hear about those hummingbirds, those geometers of flit.
And I make no apology. This is a rare poem. I mean, I researched the background of the individual poems to varying degrees, but I did not know in writing the poem when I did that there's no evidence that hummingbirds have ever lived in the Eastern Hemisphere. So,
Okay.
but I decided to stick with it, even though I understand it's not quite historically correct. Professor Emeritus. The most precocious of his students are these hummingbirds, geometers of flit, savants of hover, scholars of June air. Their formulae can stabilize a breeze, triangulate sunlight and gnarls on trees, calculate a worm's trajectory as it divides muck in its sluggish surge. Pythagoras, impressed, cannot compete with how they gauge swift race-splashed angles, merge feathered scholarship with dart and dance. He tries to count their wing beats on his abacus, divide into warm wind, except his eyes have trouble following the emerald blur, which makes more difficult a measurement of ratio of glide to how wings were.
That's beautiful.
Thank
Lee
you.
Slonimsky, Professor Emeritus. And why is emeritus in parentheses briefly?
It's really just a whimsical notion that connotes that he's reached this age, that he's in retirement.
He's older now. Lee, another poem, The Afterlife of Numbers, which is a wonderful title.
Thank you. And this poem is dedicated to my own father. It's called The Afterlife of Numbers. In documents inherited quite late, upon his ancient father's peaceful death, Pythagoras has recognized his fate, that mathematics is his blood and breath. The business language notes have left him cold, as do his father's weapons from his youth. But various calculations are like gold, which gleams with revelation, flaming truth. The very act of writing numerals, necessitated by a sea-borne trade, seems carrying out a sacred ritual. May delicate divisions never fade. His father's voice can't possibly be replaced, but here in math, his spirit leaves its trace.
Lee, that's lovely. And here again is a parallel between you and Pythagoras. The speaker talks about Pythagoras' father, and you dedicated this to your father. Is Pythagoras an alter ego for you in certain ways? You're also involved in business, as you talk about business in this poem.
This poem actually, I think, is not autobiographical at all. But my father was a kind of a business mathematician, a bookkeeper, and did accounting work. What I would like to point out, surprisingly, is that there are real things known about Pythagoras' father related to sort of shipping records that go all the way back. One thing that's notable here is that Pythagoras is one of the first figures in certainly Western history where you could even very vaguely use a term like middle class. I mean, his father was a businessman in a time period when human affairs were almost entirely dominated by the nobility, by the aristocracy, and so forth. And everything else in here is fictional. But I think Pythagoras, for a fact, believed in the sacred nature of numbers.
Lee, would you read Bells for us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Bells. It's lost forever now, the instrument he long ago invented. Abacus with tiny bells attached. Pythagoras well understood that music spaced in math. Both flute together in their lyrical truth. So songbird's skill combines pure lilt and count. He saw all this, but kept it to himself, though later others made it core belief. In worldviews, systems named for him. And now this morning he sits by a sun-streaked stream that tinkles as it flows past rocks. He plays stream music on his bells. He must allow a water song its math. In lilting ways, he reproduces sound and bright streams gleam.
The bells of the stream. That's Lee Slonimsky reading Bells. Did Pythagoras have an abacus with bells?
No, this is completely made up. I have, since almost I started writing these poems, been kind of fascinated by Pythagoras and the abacus based on the rhyme. You know, it's a perfect rhyming word. It's full of math. And so, and it was in wide use in Greece, or presumably Magna Graecia, in the century in which he lived. It goes back, I believe, much further. I think its historical origin has been traced by some to China. And in terms of Pythagoras and music, that is really not, I believe, something he explored in his own lifetime, but his influence over the next 500 years was so vast, as Charles Kahn's book shows. I mean, most of the philosophical schools in Greece in the next few centuries, including Plato's, were variations in one way or another, that it became part of a musical tradition, which was not, unlike many of his other beliefs, the Pythagorean musical tradition was honored by the church and kept alive in medieval Catholic or medieval Christian culture in Europe in a way that also, continues to the present day.
Lee, you're going to Greece. Could you tell us a little bit about your trip and what you'll be doing there?
Well, I'm going primarily to the Thessaloniki Book Festival, which is from May 4th to 8th, or actually, I think it's May 4th to 7th, and it's introducing the book to what will be the largest version of the festival, which is about 20 years old. They're now trying to make it one of the most prominent ones in Europe, and I believe there's something like 36 countries coming.
How exciting.
The United States sending a publisher delegation for the first time. So it should be a lot of fun. And I did speak there or read there in November of 2021 when the pandemic was still very much limiting. And not that it's not still around, but it appears that this festival will have a much larger attendance.
Great. If people want more information, or if listeners want more information about the book, is that forthcoming right now? Do you have information?
The book actually seems to be a bit delayed in publication. In terms of access to the book, the best place is YouTube. The publisher normally posts events. There is some discussion of the book going on already on Facebook and Instagram, but honestly, I'm no expert on accessing that. But YouTube would have eventually, I think, videos related to readings and so forth.
How would they Google this? How would they search for this?
So if you went to YouTube as a subject, and the publisher in Greece, which is a pretty big poetry publisher, is Enipnio, Enipnio. That's Enipnio Press. And the title of the book, I think anything that is related to Pythagoras and the animals.
Okay.
Potentially, if someone wanted to get the book from the publisher, they can. But probably that's still 3 or 4 weeks away.
Lee Slonimsky, it's been such a pleasure having you back on the show. And you are always deepening my knowledge about Pythagoras through your beautiful and gorgeously rhythmic poetry. So thank you very much for being on. And thank you all for listening.